So that's one of the effects of sanctification. We would be salt and light.
Yes, absolutely. Amen. And the way we become sanctified in the New Testament, it says, Yeshua said, if you obey my commandments, right?
Yes.
What are his commandments? They show up in Torah.
That's right.
Those are his commandments, right?
Yeah.
So we don't do Torah as believers. We don't do Torah to be justified. We do Torah to be sanctified, to show the world and the Father that we're choosing the way of living in righteousness. Okay?
You know, to reference the fact that men were starting to fall away from their own image of God, the image of God that they were created in, is back in Genesis 4:26, where it says, "Men begin to call upon the name of the Lord." That I've heard some translations where they say that means men begin to profane the name of the Lord. They begin to walk away and curse the name of the Lord, or Yahweh. So there's a little bit of that starting all the way back then, or they begin to not so much walk like they were supposed to.
That could be true. That's probably, there's some truth of that. And I was going to actually talk about that verse today, because my take on it is a little bit different, because right in that space between Genesis 3:15 or so, and that time, which is in what, chapter 5, end of chapter 4, you have God still there talking with mankind.
Right.
And it's interesting that he's still talking with Cain. And Cain has been born, Abel has been born, Cain has killed Abel, Seth has been born, Seth has grown up, they've had kids, and now, so it's a period of time that's been passed here. There's like 2 generations of kids that have come along.
Right.
Now, men began to call on the name of the Lord. So there was many what we would call years when God was still teaching them things. It's interesting. It's interesting. Anyway, so Torah is there to be our guide now. It's not our justification. It is our sanctification. So let's go back to the handout. Hopefully I answered questions. One more thing I want to say. Let's go to the handout, but I wanted to say this also. Just so that I'm not unduly misunderstood, when I talk about the church in the way that I have, I'm not demeaning church fellowships. I think churches are good and believers are brothers and sisters in churches. What I'm really addressing is the fact that the history of the church is that they have replaced Israel somehow. And so what's come down to us in our culture, in our Socratic culture, is that Israel's got their thing with God and the church has their thing with God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That is not scriptural,
Mm-hmm.
right? So getting back to what Moses says, the church should just be a Gentile sect of Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
Biblical Judaism, that is, not modern Judaism. The church in theology should be a sect of biblical Judaism. Like the way.
The way was a sect.
Exactly. All right, good. All right, handout. So I want to go back. Let's go back and just review again some of the structure we talked about. Some of this stuff, again, I have to say this because this is true. I just want to make sure that everybody understands. There is so much that we could go into, and so much we could spend time on and dive into and look at the Hebrew and all this kind of stuff. We just don't have time for that. I would really love to have more time sometime to do stuff specifically on specific topics, but we don't have time in this class. We just have what's left today and what's left on next Wednesday. So I kind of gloss over a lot of stuff. What I am trying to share with you is stuff that just assembles the foundational pillars of where we go with Bible understanding. So the things that I'm talking about here are parts of those pillars. So we know that, number one, time is structured in Genesis. There's 2 different ways that time is structured. One, it is structured with days, and that means that it's structured. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's a recurring structure. We also know that there was appointed times that were established based upon lunar cycles and sun cycles, and these appointed times were called moedim, and we know about those. We talked about those in Sukkot most recently. That there are times when God has set aside a moment when He wants to speak with us. So number 2 is an important premise here that we need to understand. That underlying premise of process for designed life is in His image for us and after His kind for everything else. So the design of process, the design of growth process by the Creator is that it's always in His image after its kind. So there's a destiny in seeds that propagates itself. Ideally, would have done it forever. Okay? So we go to number 3. Creation as it was designed was to be a continuous growth process as measured from day 1. Remember how we talked about when it says in the evening and the morning was the first day? That is a cardinal number. The word is echad. It's a cardinal number. The rest of the numbers, day 2, 3, 4, 5, are ordinal numbers. Cardinal number, ordinal numbers. And so what that means is that the day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 follow the benchmark of day 1. Everything follows from day 1. So that's when the process begins. Creation was a generative process versus a degenerative process. God created seeds on the days of life, day 4, 5, and 6. He created seeds, and that was the event of Him creating the seeds. On the day of when He stood back and said, "My job is done. I'm going to take a rest. I'm done with my project. I've designed my project." The design was for that process to continue forever in the 7th day. It wasn't a static creation. It was a dynamic in that day that He created. It was static that day, but the rest of creation for eternity was dynamic. Yes?
I have a question. So I just need a little more clarification about this day 1 as the cardinal number.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that the first day 1 and then day 2 and on follow after that? Even the next day 1, does it follow after that?
Yes.
So the very first day is the only cardinal?
Yes.
And that, why do I need to know that?
Because that's our reference point for when we. So what year is it in the Jewish calendar? Okay, whatever it is. If we were to rewind that back to day 1, it needs to start there. So it's our benchmark for everything in history. All of the Moedim go from day 1. So, and this kind of, and I don't want to get off on this rabbit trail, but this kind of speaks to the idea of, is Saturday the Sabbath, really?
Yeah.
Right? Because it doesn't matter what Pope so-and-so said, or Emperor Julius said, or whoever. It doesn't matter what they set up. The way the Israelites counted it was day 7, day 7, day 7. Gentiles can impose their calendars wherever they want to. What's important for the Israelites and for the Bible believers is, are we counting back day 7, day 7, day 7, day 7, day 7? And so when you get to the 7th week of the seventh week of Shavuot, for example, it's all about what follows day after day after day after day, right? So it doesn't. Again, I don't want to get off on that rabbit trail, but just know that we don't have to really deal with the question of, is Sabbath on Saturday. As it turns out, the way the calendar has been imposed on culture since about the 4th century, Saturday is the Sabbath. But that's the Gentiles who did that. The Sabbath is just a series of sevens from day one.
So you're not saying that any day can be your seventh day, because we all have to be on the same.
Any day relative to the Gentile reckoning of time can be any day,
But not.
but not according to the biblical timeline.
But it has, but are you saying then that Saturday is what we have to accept as being?
For today, yes. In our
Because
culture,
that's all we know.
in our culture, that's the way it calculates. Is that the Sabbath that we have today is on Saturday? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we
Yeah.
can't,
Yes.
yes, and we just chose, yes.
Right. So
Yes, won't go down there, but yes,
It-
I understand.
depending on the culture that we're in and the king who wants to start a new calendar,
Yeah,
Sabbath could be on a Wednesday.
right.
It doesn't. For us, it doesn't matter. What matters to us is that 7, 7, 7, 7 from day echad.
Which corresponds to Saturday.
Right.
Has anybody ever calculated those?
Oh, the rabbis have, yes.
And so they're doing the right Sabbath and we don't know what it is.
They
Well, no, we are doing the right
They
Sabbath.
use the same
So Saturday is the right.
Saturday in our culture is the Sabbath.
right now around the world.
Yes.
What-
Why do you
Friday
say our
evening
culture?
to Saturday evening.
When I say our culture, I'm talking culture from about Constantine forward.
Because of the way he established a calendar.
Yeah.
Because they would say their calendar is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. They wouldn't say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Is that what you're saying?
The Israelites, yes. So the way you say first in Hebrew is Rishon. It's the ordinal number in Hebrew is Rishon. It doesn't say in the Hebrew in the text, it doesn't say day 1 Rishon. It says Yom Echad, a cardinal number. So that is a benchmark. Day 2 is Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, and so forth. And those numbers are ordinal numbers. And it's just because the first one is the reference point. We still confused? Okay.
No, I you say our culture. That's what I'm saying.
What, if they know, if the rabbis know what day it is, then why
I
doesn't
don't think it's
the entire world
It's just
know?
every seventh.
It's just every seventh day? Because we're going by a calendar that Constantine came up with?
It just so happens that the calendar that we have, I forget if it's a Julian calendar or the
Gregorian.
Whatever.
Gregorian calendar. It's probably Gregorian. It just so happens that Saturday is where our seventh day lands
Yes.
in this Gregorian calendar. You get it?
And it's been that way a long time.
Because our calendar starts with Sunday as day 1. So our 7th day is Saturday,
Yes.
according to the Gregorian calendar.
If we compare the Israelite way of reckoning time, the biblical way of reckoning time, with the Gregorian calendar, they calculate it out so that Saturday is Sabbath.
Yes. Right. So it is raining.
In the Julian calendar, it might have been Thursday. I don't know. In the calendars that Rome used, it might have been Monday. Who knows? I don't know. But the reckoning is based upon
Still 7 days.
the 7 day.
The 7th day.
We still
the seventh
have
day.
7-day calendar. There's still, it doesn't matter
So
where
they,
they go.
they,
Yeah.
so they went back as far as they could go back, and from that, the sevens became
Yes.
the pattern.
Yes.
Because we can't go back as far, because of the way calendars
Right.
were.
Right.
We can only go back so far.
Yeah,
So
you
they
just
went
have
back
to-
as far as they
You just have to
could go.
regress it, probably using a computer, regress it 7 days, 7, 7, 7, 7, and go all the way back until you get to day 1.
Gotcha.
And then compare that with when Pope Gregory assigned that calendar,
Mhm.
and just compare it.
They've tried to do longer weeks, but it never worked out.
And they've tried to do shorter weeks, too.
7-day.
I mean, they try to move away from the 7th day.
But it doesn't.
Yeah, they have. They have. All right, so let's get back on text here because we're running out of time.
Sorry.
I mean, good question. I know that was a festering question, so I had to take that rabbit trail.
Thank you.
So number 4, God, he's a diversity in unity. Man, he's a diversity in unity. And that's kind of a minor point, but it's something that helps us to understand what we are in his image. God said, let us make man in our image. I mean, that included a lot of points, but it also included the diversity of our character. So, I don't know, we don't know, there's not enough information to make this a strict understanding, but there is a correlation between what we call Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and my body, my mind, and my spirit. There is a correlation there, and I don't know exactly what it is, and I don't think we can know exactly what it is. But that's the correlation between the diversity. We are a diversity in unity, just as the Father is, just as the Creator is. Number 5, God is an infinite being, wholly other apart from creation. This is another important takeaway from the foundation. And this might be getting kind of heavy, but try to absorb it as much as you can. Infinite being or finite being. Man is a finite being whose identity is intimately bound up to creation, but exists existential. But as he is a man is existentially blessed with a conditional, infinite heritage and potential infinite experience as a being of conscious identity as a gift from the Creator. This is the essence, this is part of the lie that Lucifer gave to Eve, is that man, you are just as infinite as the Creator is. Man is a finite being who has the permission of God, of the infinite God, to be alive as long as he meets the condition of the covenant. Yes.
Which they did before sin, so they were eternal.
At that time, they were eternal, conditionally immortal before they took of the fruit. Yes. Man, designed, created, given living existence, intimately bound to the seeding premise of all life. So we talked about this ad nauseum, maybe. That man was intimately bound to creation. The identity of man was that he had a physical body, lived in a physical garden, in a physical planet, in a physical universe. In that environment, he was commanded to be fruitful and multiply. So he was part of the seeding process. And in that process of seeding over time, it would result in the community of the family of God if they did not sin. We talked about number 7 here briefly. We'll just skip that for sake of time. From Genesis chapter 4 onward, number 8, the Bible is the revelation, the growth, the unveiling of the chosen people, which are the remnant of righteous seed for the generations as governed or in the context of man's choices. Man was given a choice to be covenant obedient or not to be. If he was in the realm and community of the righteous. If he was obedient to covenant. If he was disobedient, he gave up that place. So I've mentioned these terms before, but I'm going to try to explain them a little bit more here, and we'll talk about them maybe extensively next time. But archetype. So the Bible from Genesis chapter 4 onward, up until the time we get to the millennial kingdom, uses what's called archetypes in showing its unveiling of God's intention for the new heavens, new earth. Follow me so far?
Yes.
Okay. So when he took the Israelites into the desert and he commanded them to make the tabernacle itself, the Mishkan, as it's called in the Hebrew, was an archetype of ultimately the new heavens and new earth in Revelation 21 and 22, in which the presence of God would abide with man. Okay? It was an archetype. As the Israelites went through all that they went through, and they arrived in the promised land under David and Solomon, they built the temple, and even after Solomon's temple, when Ezra and Nehemiah came back and built the second temple, and then in the future when the third temple is built, those three physical temples on the planet are going to be archetypes of the temple sanctuary of God, where God has chosen to place his name. That's going to be in the new heavens and new earth, right? So those physical temples are the archetype of the new heavens and new earth, place where we will be with him as that temple. We individually are stones of that temple in which he will dwell forever with us. That's the idea. So that is the temple or sanctuary of God, where God has chosen to place his name. Now you have an archetype of person as well. So he had the seed, the future seed of her seed was shown to be Moses, the lawgiver. That was the first archetype. He's they often refer to Moses as a Messiah figure, a prototype or something like that. So he was a messianic figure. Then we have David, which is another archetype of the Messiah, of the king, of her seed that would have victory over death. Then, of course, we had Yeshua, and he actually did have victory over death, and he has actually become the chief cornerstone of that temple in the new heavens and new earth. We're not there yet, but he is the chief cornerstone of that temple. Then we have the archetype of a people, and that is Israel. Israel is the family name of the righteous remnant of God. Now, what does the word Israel mean? It comes from, it means Prince of God. So Israel, as the name Prince of God, remember, Israel was a man, right? And a nation. So here's the one and the many. Prince. So how is Israel, the many, going to be the Prince of God? Israel, the nation, will rule the planet in the millennium. That will be the kingship, the authority of the planet, is Israel. And the prophets also, I can't tell you right off the top of my head, but the prophets also talk about how the rulership of the world, the nations, I think it's Zechariah, the nations will come up to Israel, come up to the temple on Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, right? So they will be controlling all of that. All right, so that's all archetypes. So we see that being proliferated through history. So history is not random. These things in Scripture are not random. They're there by design to show us where we're going. Okay, so we have these two seeds that came out of the garden. We have Cain and then Seth, and we have this dual line of people coming down to us, of seeds coming down to us. The seed of the righteous people of Israel comes down to us, ends up in Yeshua, and then with us because we've been grafted in, who he is and the nation that he's put together. So we're part of that. So what do we expect in our future? We expect as the remnant to be brought into the kingdom of Messiah, whether we're dead or alive. If we're dead, we'll be resurrected. If we're alive, we'll be translated. Right? So, but what is around us now? What's around us now is the global village mentality of Cain. Right? So again, this is not something that's random. This is something that's happening in history. When Enoch, Cain's son, was born, it says that Enoch built a city and made a name for himself. So the name of Cain's son immediately went to making a name for ourselves. So he took it upon himself to make himself self-aggrandize. So Enoch became what the world is trying to do, is self-aggrandize. When we go past the flood, when we get to the descendants of Ham, what did they do? They created the Tower of Babel. Let's make a name for ourselves, right? So anytime we get the people of Cain, the descendants of Cain, and I use that loosely because it's not genetic necessarily. It's just Cain represents those people who decide to do things their own way instead of God's way. So the descendants of Cain, in this context, want to make a name for themselves apart from the intervention of the Creator. They're going on the lie that they are somebody and they're eternal. And so that is the kingdom that's facing us today. We are being surrounded by the people that want to take the promises of God in the prophets and made to the remnant and usurp those promises and take them for themselves and make a name for themselves. And so when we see, return to Babylon is what it is. And when we see what's going on around us with the politics and all that, just know, and this is a subject for another class maybe, just know that we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, right? And remember what the feet were made of? Clay and iron. That's where we are. We are at the feet of that figure. That the clay and iron means that you're going to have a mixture of kingdoms that have come together for the purpose of making the statue great. And that's going to happen in if not in our immediate future, in the future of our kids. I don't know how long we're going to live, but it's coming soon. And everything that's going on around us is what's part of this. Now, before we close, let me go to Let me go to 2 Corinthians. So 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And I'm going to address a verse here that you've all had questions about, but I want to do it in the context of what we're talking about here. Is that we don't want to get, and this is one of my objectives, is I want to try to help us understand that when we talk about the gospel is not about going to heaven. That's completely Socratic. We're not saved from going to a fiery hell when we die. That's Socratic. Now there is a hell, to be sure, but nobody gets there until the judgment. And that's going to happen at the end of Revelation. That hasn't happened yet. So my effort is to try to get us to think in terms of what's in our future, because that's what we have to watch. We have to watch what happens in Israel and Jerusalem. There is a role that the children of Jacob have to play in the end times. Judah, in particular, has a role to play in the end times. And so I'll speak more on this next time, perhaps. But we can't, in our faith in the answer of in all the conversations about the gospel, we cannot reject the role of Israel, nation of Israel as it stands, and the the tribe of Judah as it stands. God has yet a purpose for them, and they are going to rule in the millennial kingdom. We will rule with them, but they still have a role. So this is not about us becoming Jews. It's about us being in the Israelite family. But they, as our elder brother, have a designated role. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. I just have to say that. So let's turn to chapter 5 of 2 Corinthians, and hopefully we'll close shortly on this. One of the things that we don't hear very often when we go to these New Testament letters from Paul is we don't understand that when these letters were written, the believing community, especially outside of Jerusalem, were under severe persecution. And so they were having tribulations, persecutions, executions. They were having all kinds of things happen to them. And that was the context in which some of these letters were written. And so when we read 2 Corinthians chapter, let's start a verse or two in chapter 1, and then we'll go back to 5. So in chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as the sufferings of Messiah abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Messiah. Now, if we are afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation, which is effective for enduring the same sufferings that we also suffer. Or if we are comforted, it is for your consolation and salvation. And our hope for you is steadfast, because we know that as you are partakers of the sufferings, so also will you be partaking of the consolation." And then he goes on in the rest of chapter 1 there to talk about that. But let's go back to chapter 5 again. So when Paul wrote this, they were enduring extreme persecution. Now, let's go back a little bit to the way the Hebrews think about stuff, and the way that the way Moses thinks about stuff, and the way Socrates thinks about stuff. The way Socrates thinks about stuff is that there's a distinction between material and spiritual. The way the Hebrews think is that there's no distinction between material and spiritual. Material is spiritual. It just depends on which spirit we're talking about. So when the Hebrew looks at the word tent, he's thinking temporary. He's not thinking eternal. And he bases that upon the idea of the Mishkan versus the temple on the Temple Mount. And in the New Testament, in the stuff to come yet. So when they talk about a tent, they're thinking of in the mode of what is temporary. So when he says in chapter 5, verse 1, "For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." So what he says here is that when this temporary place is destroyed, we are looking forward to getting our permanent place. He's not talking about escaping the tent to go to heaven. He's talking about a future time when the permanent dwelling will arrive. That's how the Hebrews thought. Just as when they were wandering in the desert with the Mishkan, they were told that they were going to go into the promised land, and arriving in the promised land and building the temple was the fulfillment of the archetype of the Mishkan in the desert. In like fashion, in this temporary tent, we're looking for when we'll have our permanent tent in the promised land. Okay? So he says in verse 2, "For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven." And when is that going to happen? Future. as a translation if we live long enough, and as a resurrection if we don't. If indeed, having been clothed, we shall be found naked, we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed. He's speaking against the people that believe what Socrates believes. We're not looking forward to losing our bodies. We don't want to be unclothed. We don't want to just lose our temporary and be unclothed. We want to go from temporary to permanent. So when he says we do not want to be unclothed, he's saying that we don't want to follow the mantra of Socrates. We want to, for we are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed with our future body, so that mortality may be swallowed up by life. The death in the temporary will be swallowed up by life only when we're not living in the temporary. All right. Now, he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has also given us a Spirit as a guarantee. For we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. Okay, here is the tricky one. All right, let's read it in context. Let's read it in context. What is the context? Temporary, permanent. It's not about earth and heaven. It's about temporary and permanent.
It's so simple when you say that.
Okay? We are confident knowing that while we are at home in this body, this temporary body, we are absent from him. It's self-evident. We're absent from him because we had this temporary thing going on. He's not come back yet. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, yes, well pleased rather to be absent from this body and to be present with that body. That's the context. I'm putting words in there, but that's the context. Okay? It's about tent and permanent dwelling. It's about thinking like a Hebrew, not like Socrates. Okay? Any questions on that?
Well, the next sentence, I got me confused. Therefore, whether at home or away, we try our utmost to please him. How can we be
That's true.
at home or away? Whether temporary.
Whether we are in our temporary home or in our permanent home, we want to please him.
So we're trying to please him here, and then we're going to try to please him there.
Absolutely.
So we still could possibly not please him there.
That's like.
I don't think that's possible. I think he's just making rhetoric here for that. But
Make it confusing there.
I think what he's saying is that we all know that we want to please him there,
Right.
Absolutely.
but we want to please him here too.
Yes.
So that's I think that's what he's saying. Okay. Please, if you have questions, please write them down. I know this is hard to absorb right off the bat, so please write your questions down. Next week is going to be mostly talking about your questions.
Okay, question.